Welcome to Novara Live, coming up tonight. Multiple wildfires are burning across Britain as the Met Office warns that extreme UK weather is becoming the new normal. Starmer marks his last day as Labour leader. We'll be going over some of his greatest hits. Gary Lineker has taken Andy Burnham to task on Gaza and the UK's relationship with Donald Trump. And of course, Argentina has accused the UK of a, quote, military incursion into their naval territory just hours after the World Cup semi-final. I'm Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG, and I'm joined tonight for Ladies' Night back in the studio with Dalia Gebrial. Dalia, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. I mean, I'm obviously devastated that the country of my birth could not avenge the country of my origin last night. I'm talking about England losing to Argentina after Argentina stole Egypt's victory from them. But I'm sure, there's always next time.
That's true. And we still have the powerful forces of Pedro Sanchez, fingers crossed, to stand in the way of the RGs. Now, if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. You can also listen to the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And don't forget to let us know what you think in the comments section down below. A wildfire 2 miles wide has forced locals out of their homes and the evacuation of campsites and ski resorts in Scotland's Cairngorms National Park overnight. The Scottish Government has now said it's under control, but 300 hectares of land are estimated to have been burned. Now, this latest blaze comes after a series of wildfires across England and Wales this week. At one point, 19 wildfires were burning simultaneously, according to the National Fire Chiefs Council. With the UK in the grip of a record-breaking heatwave for the last few weeks, experts say we are now also experiencing the worst what they call fire wave the country has ever seen. And in a report this week, the Met Office came to the extraordinary conclusion that extreme weather is the new normal here. This is the report's lead author, Mike Kendon, speaking at the Met Office YouTube channel.
What is immediately apparent, obviously, is this warming trend that we see from the 1980s to date. We're warming at about 1/4 of a degree per decade. We've just had the warmest year on record in 2025. Bear in mind that this series is 140 odd years long. But the warmest the last 4 years are all in the warmest 5. And that statistic would really be impossible without man-made climate change. So our climate is very much on the move. Essentially, what we are saying is that the climate in terms of temperature of the 20th century has gone. We are in that climate no more. We're in a new climate now.
Kendon also said that new, warmer climates are emerging in the southeast and that the UK is losing its coldest habitats from the tops of mountains in the northern uplands. Despite that data from the Met Office and others, our right-wing politicians continue to deny there's anything to see here as they roll back net zero goals. The quote-unquote business-friendly reform is unlikely to be swayed by a new report from the Green Party-linked Verdant think tank, which calculated that June heatwave caused a £2.4 billion hit to productivity. But away from the Westminster bubble, firefighters are the ones actually dealing with this on the front lines. Earlier today, I spoke to Joanne Trafford, an active firefighter and brigade organiser for the FBU of North Wales, which has seen some of the worst fires. I began asking, given the endless cuts, how is the fire service coping with this current fire wave?
Yeah, it really is a challenge. So we have coped barely, but firefighters here, our members and all the firefighters in North Wales are doing really long hours and the conditions are really challenging. So, I mean, everyone struggles in this heat, but when you're in this heat and you're traipsing up hillsides and mountains and you're facing tall flames at the same time, it's a really difficult environment to be working long hours in. And it's not, I know that the fire in Conway, which is very close to where I live, that my crew and Llandudno Station were there with, I think there's about 10 crews there at one point. That wasn't the only wildfire. So there's wildfires throughout North Wales and throughout the country, and that put a huge drain on resources, both resources of our own in North Wales Fire and Rescue Service, but also resources that we rely on from other agencies and services as well.
And how are they coping? I'm assuming it must be very challenging.
Yeah, I think tired. Everybody muscles through as best they can. I think that we're very fortunate that in North Wales specifically, in the more rural places of the fire service, we rely a lot on our retained firefighters. So most of our firefighters are retained colleagues, and that means that they have their primary employment elsewhere and they're serving their local communities as a second job. So to do really long shifts away from their primary employment with no notice can be very difficult, and that they still got to go back to the day job, So it is difficult. I know that some of the crews that I popped in to see and see how they're faring are very red-faced and sunburned and got very red, puffy eyes where the smoke has impacted them, and relying heavily on local services to ply them with food and drinks at times. And it's hard.
Experts are saying that this is unprecedented for the UK, that we've never seen anything like this before. Is that your sense as someone on the front line?
Not really, no, not talking from personal experience. I think the intensity at which fires burn is developing and changing year on year, because it's so hot and dry that it's very difficult once you extinguish a fire for it to remain that way. That is getting worse over time. I don't know what all of the statistics are elsewhere. I know that we were battling sort of fires in North Wales, in Conway and Harlech and Helkin and Bethesda. And it has been very intense, but in recent years, we've faced that before. It's every year, that the wildfires are burning for longer and they're covering more ground. And it's when it's dry like this, it's just very, very difficult to contain. And if then the wind picks up, then it just becomes nigh impossible to extinguish the fire and effectively and quickly. We see this every summer.
That's fair enough. And so in these cases, what's mainly the cause of most of these fires, do you know?
It's a little bit of everything. I'd say that the majority of wildfires are caused by some form of human intervention. I think that in most cases it's accidental. We have seen some deliberate fires caused in recent years, particularly in North Wales, where there've been remnants and evidence to suggest that probably local youth have lit on fires deliberately, possibly not with the understanding of what the ultimate consequences may be, because they're so drastic now. But I'd say that we see fires, it could be just somebody not putting out a cigarette effectively, barbecues because it's summer. And I'd say that people don't understand the things that they do and what sort of impact they have on the environment now that it's so hot. And then we have farmers who sort of have to burn on their land, and sometimes those things can go out of control. So there's a number of things that cause it, but yes, I would say that the vast majority of it will have some form of human intervention of some kind.
Obviously, given what we're seeing at the moment, like as a union, like in general, how are your colleagues all supporting each other at the moment?
Just with long hours, messages of solidarity, everything that you'd expect. This is always a topic of conversation for us. We do have to work with the leadership team and fight hard for resources and services. So we have had some improvements in recent years to help us deal with wildfires. So we've now got a sort of lightweight wildfire kit, because as you can imagine, a proper compartment fire heavy kit, which you will see on, in all social media posts. There's still many of our firefighters out there wearing that kit, and it's very hard to do that sort of work in heavy clothing that doesn't allow heat to come out. But we do have lighter weight kit now. We've got narrow access vehicles. The service has worked with the union in recent years to have welfare vehicles so that we have some facilities to go to the toilet and have some food and somewhere to wash our hands, etc. But there's always limitations with these things. If you're on a mountain, even having enough drinking water when you need it is a huge logistical challenge to get things to people. They're in gorse and ferns and on foot and on steep mountainsides, and it's hard to get one person to where they need to be, never mind all the resources and things that they need to stay safe. So yeah, I think it's quite frustrating for our members that this isn't a new message. We see these wildfires intensifying in the summer, burning for longer because we have dry spells for longer and the weather's hotter. And then in the winter, we're seeing the flooding intensify, and that's becoming worse. So this message is the same every year. It's getting worse. We need more resources, more interventions, and it's not something that hasn't been predicted. Everybody knows this is happening. All the authorities know this is happening. The government knows it's happening. So it does become quite upsetting for a lot of members that it can all be resolved with investment at the end of the day. And it's the investment that we need to make sure that firefighters stay safe and that we can have enough people doing the job and retain our firefighters and our experience to continue to tackle this over the long term. And that's really what we need.
And what are your, negotiations like, do you know, with the government in terms of potential extra funding, or is that something you've not seen on the cards as of yet?
I don't know in regards to funding. There would be other officials in the union that'd be far closer to that topic than I am. I know that the union do have a seat at the table. They are talking about the needs of the fire service and the needs of the union and our members on a regular basis. That's sort of a positive relationship we have in the sense that we are having the conversations, but seeing that come through to the front line and our members feeling like we're having what we need to do a good job, to do the job effectively, and to have the relief that we need and the rest that firefighters need when these things happen. I would say that most people would say no. We're not getting what we need in that regard. It's some people are working like 18 hours on these things, and we have relief crews that come in, but the rest time is short, and we rely on resources that are not just from our services. We rely on, if we want the natural resources Wales helicopter to come and help us deal with these things, it's a shared resource, so it can't come and help us here because unfortunately it's already elsewhere. And we rely on our North Wales Police to help us with drone footage so that we can actually assess the scope of the incident and where the risk points are, so that we can deploy crews where they need to be. And these are not our assets. We don't control them. We don't always have access to them, and that is an ever increasing challenge. Whereas with adequate investment, then we would have more scope to utilise things ourselves.
And I guess one last question I would ask is, obviously we've got quite a large audience. Is there anything that we can do broadly as an audience to be able to help out?
Yeah, I'd say get the message out there. I think it's always difficult when it comes to investments because the public sector everywhere, everybody knows that there's a lot of pressure on the NHS. There's a lot of pressure on the fire service, and everybody's feeling it now. I think we've had many years of austerity, and it's just something's got to change. If we know these wildfires are going to intensify and get worse every year, as well as the flooding, etc. I think just liking the union posts, the union will be very proactive in posting up challenges that we're facing. We're consistently having to battle across the country to stop stations from closing, to save firefighter jobs. For example, the Conway fire that we have here now, that's still smoking across the way. I've been at the beach all day today, and I can still see all the smoke rising above the mountain. We're still utilising crews there. That station was at threat of closure a couple of years ago. So because of funding challenges that we have, had the union not fought against those closures and had long, arduous negotiations with our service here about other ways that we can improve fire cover in different areas without closing stations and without cutting numbers of firefighter jobs, ultimately, that station would have been closed had we not fought against it, and that would have had disastrous consequences for how the availability and how quickly we could have attended this fire.
That was firefighter Joanne Trafford speaking to me earlier today. On Monday, we will have our 7th Prime Minister in a decade, as Keir Starmer will tender his resignation to King Charles to allow the newly minted Labour leader Andy Burnham to move into number 10. With Starmer's premiership almost over, I thought it would be worth looking back at his political career and wondering if all of this was inevitable. Sworn in 2015 during Ed Miliband's shock defeat, he had been tipped to be a future big player from the start, widely believed to be in line to be Miliband's Attorney General had he gone on to win the election. There was even a handful of people wanting him to be Labour leader at the time, leading to him to tweet out that someone with more experience than him should run after the hashtag #KeirForLeader went semi-viral. It's amazing what being head of the Crown Prosecution Service will get you in a claim, despite him at the time having literal zero potential political aptitude. He was immediately made a shadow minister by newly elected Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, only to be part of a series of mass resignations in 2016. This was dubbed by Corbyn supporters as the, quote, chicken coup, in a bid to force the Labour leader at the time to resign. And he also backed challenger Owen Smith in the subsequent leadership election. Might want to put a pin in that one, as despite his disloyalty to the whims of the Labour membership in electing Corbyn twice, he was promoted to shadow Brexit secretary almost immediately after Corbyn was re-elected. According to The Guardian, a source claims he almost resigned multiple times, yet he stuck around for the remainder of Corbyn's term as leader, crucially being part of the negotiating team that met the Theresa May government when she approached Labour to find a compromise solution to her Brexit impasse. As all of this was going on, however, a previously unknown figure named Morgan McSweeney wasn't happy. He was the director of a think tank named Labour Together, initially supposed to be a broad church of voices throughout the Labour Party. But once McSweeney took over, it was tasked with the single purpose of expunging Corbynism from the Labour Party. They'd even done an analysis that showed their worst-case scenario was Corbyn potentially winning an election, something they regarded as a very real possibility. Anushka Asthana describes meeting with members of the group in this excerpt from her book, Taken as Read. We sat on red chairs with gold trimming, sat around a long, thin table covered with a white tablecloth, listening to McSweeney, Crodus, Reid and Andy and Mahmood tell us about Labour Together's plans for renewal. They had brought with them another MP, who was just starting to do more with the group, Keir Starmer. The project was pitched as planned with the soft, cuddly Greenpeace framing. They neatly sidestepped our more cynical questions about their plans for future leadership. Alongside me at that night was Guardian News editor Dan Saber, who had since told me he immediately wondered if Starmer was their candidate. So we have a Brexit secretary who reportedly considered resigning after previously having been part of a coup to oust the leader in 2016, meeting with a group explicitly set up to oppose Corbynism. No conflicts of interest there, I am sure. Now, let's go back to those Brexit talks. How committed was Starmer in finding a Brexit compromise, you may ask? Well, Theresa May's Chief of Staff Gavin Barwell didn't seem to think he was. He noted in his memoirs that Starmer had been the main impediment to any deal, to the point of Barwell deliberately copying proposals Starmer himself had submitted previously, to which Starmer then objected, to only Barwell pointing out that these were his own words. With the Brexit issue unsolved, Starmer was in a prime position as shadow Brexit minister to direct policy on the issue, leading to this moment at the 2018 Labour conference.
It's right that Parliament has the first say. It's right that Parliament has the first say. But if we need to break the impasse, our options must include campaigning for a public vote, and nobody is ruling out Remain as an option.
Yeah, that in 2017, Labour had run on accepting the results of the manifesto, or the referendum, and Labour, however, adopted a second referendum policy on Brexit. The Red Wall deserted the party, the election was lost, and the rest is history. It was Labour's worst defeat by seat total in the post-war period. Voters betrayed by the party's U-turn on Brexit turned to Boris Johnson to get it done, and Corbyn resigned in electoral failure. Starmer, however, didn't seem to think the Corbyn project was dead in the water, at least not publicly. In fact, he praised both Corbyn and the policies multiple times during the leadership election that followed.
Pay tribute to Jeremy Corbyn, who led our party through some really difficult times, who energised our movement, and who's a friend as well as a colleague. We have to show we're the party of the Green New Deal, where we no longer have the question or the debate, well, it's good for the economy but bad for the environment. Not anymore. If it's bad for the environment, it's bad for the economy. Jeremy Corbyn made our party the party of anti-austerity, and he was right to do so. The party that would fight cuts to public services. He made us the party that wanted to invest more heavily in our public services, and he was right to do so. And we must retain that. We build on that. We don't trash it as we go forward. We should treat, if you like, the 2017 manifesto as our foundational document. The radicalism and the hope that that inspired across the country was real. Anybody who knocked on a door in that elections knows it was real.
To win over the Labour membership, he launched his campaign to be leader with 10 pledges. These included increasing taxation on the top 5%, public ownership of mail, energy and water, defending free movement as we leave the European Union, and abolishing universal credit, and putting human rights at the heart of foreign policy, among many, many other things. He also said this during the campaign to then North of Tyne Mayor Jamie Driscoll.
One of the most important things is unifying the party. We've been taking lumps out of each other. We're too divisive. And if we don't change that, we won't win the next general election. Yeah. So we have to unite. That doesn't mean everybody agreeing, because you're never going to get that in the Labour Party, but it does mean creating an environment which people can respectfully disagree and come together and make a decision and move forward.
Well, if you look at what Boris Johnson did, and I'm not advocating it, he just took the whip away from 25 Tories and had done with it. Now, I'm guessing from your facial expression, you wouldn't go that far.
I don't
What would you do?
If you're going to go for unity, you've got to inspire people to come together. you can't force them to come together. And disciplining people to be united is going nowhere. So the only way in the end to unite the Labour Party is to be very clear that's what you want to do, to recognise there will be different views and to reconcile them, and to have a culture and a spirit where people genuinely want to pull together. I think that is possible.
Oh, that sounds really good, doesn't it? How about that? Like no factional expulsions and removing the whip. Do you bring people together through debate? Alongside a bunch of progressive Labour policies. This all sounds a bit good, doesn't it? And the leadership electorate of the Labour Party, they all agreed. He overwhelmingly won the leadership election against the Corbyn-backed Rebecca Long-Bailey. But one of the first things Starmer did was appoint his chief of staff. It just happened to be one Morgan McSweeney. Remember him? The brains behind the group whose sole purpose was to nix the policies that Starmer was championing, both in the shadow cabinet and during the leadership election. One by one, the pledges that Starmer had previously supported were dropped, and the factional purges that Starmer had said he wouldn't do began. Multiple left-wing figures were blocked from standing as MPs, including former leader Jeremy Corbyn, in what was later revealed to be a plan by Morgan McSweeney and his former mentor Peter Mandelson to construct a parliamentary Labour Party loyal to the new regime. In a bid to appeal to centrist voters, he also publicly admonished the former leader that he had called a friend and a colleague just 3 years ago.
I haven't spoken to Jeremy Corbyn for 2.5 years now. So,
is he a friend? Was he a friend?
No, I mean, as I say, I haven't spoken to him for 2.5 years.
In 2020, he was a friend. So
he's a colleague, he's a friend, and he's led us through some really difficult times in the Labour Party.
I asked for those that have been most hurt by what had happened in relation to anti-Semitism simply to give me the space to show what I could do. I didn't think I could ask them for their support. I said, give me the space to show that I mean what I say. I meant what I said. And that is why Jeremy Corbyn lost the whip when he responded as he did to the terrible report on anti-Semitism that we had, and why he now won't stand as a Labour candidate.
He was never a friend.
No, not in the sense that we were, went to visit each other or anything like that. I worked with him as a colleague, but as I say, I haven't spoken to Jeremy now for 2.5 years.
Yeah, Keir Starmer means what he says, chat. He means what he says. I wonder if those words might haunt him. He had successfully created the party in McSweeney's image. Every trace of the previous regime had been rooted out, including its leader, and in his mind, he was ready to face the electorate, in prime position to be the next Prime Minister after the Liz Truss mini-budget and the Russo-Ukrainian war that blew up the British economy. Labour went into the election promising very little of Starmer's original platform in the leadership election, ruling out major tax rises and nationalisations. And when the 2024 election came around, Labour was elected in a landslide, at least in terms of seats. With only 33% of the vote and fewer votes than the 2019 loss, the party got a whopping 63% of the seats in Parliament and a majority of over 100. Dubbed the Loveless Landslide, it was a broad but shallow coalition of historic Labour voters and people who were just sick of the Conservative Party. Meaning, whilst Labour had a lot of legislative power, they didn't have much wiggle room politically with the public. They had campaigned on the promise of change, the single word change, on the front of the manifesto. And yet, when they got into office, they only offered the same doom and gloom of the Tories.
That's what we've inherited. Not just an economic black hole, a societal black hole. And that's why we have to take action and do things differently. And part of that is being honest with people about the choices that we face, how tough this will be. And frankly, things will get worse before they get better.
Indeed so. Keir Starmer needs to be honest with people. What about the fact that in the run-up to the election, the Institute for Fiscal Studies had pointed out that there was a conspiracy of silence between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party in not acknowledging that there was going to be around about £20 billion worth of cuts to unprotected public sector services should there not be tax rises, which is very similar to the amount of the £22 billion black hole that was deemed to be necessary to fix through some tax rises and some cuts. The cuts that they decided that they had to do, whether it's winter fuel, which we'll come on to in a second, were part and parcel of this kind of Osborneite approach to governance. You come into office and you say, the other party, they've screwed everything up. They've screwed everything up. You're going to have to pay to fix it. It's not our fault, it's their fault, right? And if you thought that you'd get away with it in the way that George Osborne did in 2010, for example, maybe they would have been successful, but they promised change. The public was sick. The public are absolutely sick of continually having to deal with problem after problem after problem. They wanted actual hope and real change. And they came into office and they decided we're going to project doom and gloom. We're going to talk down the economy, which apparently spooked the markets in some ways as well. And then they decided, you know who we're going to make the people to pay for the problems that we're inheriting in this economy, right? We're going to choose the biggest electoral demographic in the country, which is pensioners, by engaging what most people would describe as their original sin in means testing the winter fuel allowance. Again, something that they said they wanted to do in 2014. Rachel Reeves said it when I believe she was a junior shadow Treasury minister. Said they wanted to means test the winter fuel allowance when Ed Miliband was the Labour leader, and yet wasn't in the manifesto. People reacted negatively to it, right? You go where they went after this group of people in the country who always vote. And that was part and parcel. It was this kind of emblematic problem that then continued further and further and further the more that they governed, and they failed to be able to create a narrative of change. Now, not only content with angering the largest voter bloc in the country with cuts to fix this supposed black hole, they also went after the disabled as well. In April 2025, the government announced plans to drastically reduce eligibility for disability welfare, potentially plunging hundreds of thousands of vulnerable people into poverty. It's a penny pinch for the Treasury. And the thing, of course, is that the tactic they're engaging in here was this idea that we've looked at the polling. Polling say people want welfare cuts. One of the whole emblematic things about the 2015 Labour project they went into the manifesto with, they went into the election with, was this idea that the public have accepted that austerity is correct, that deficit reduction is the correct way to go, and that welfare cuts are necessary, and that welfare budget is too high. They'd accepted the benefit street narrative. It's why Harriet Harman, when she became interim Labour leader, whipped to abstain on George Osborne's welfare bill, which had the 2-child cap on universal credit as part of those policies. It was why it's really emblematic of Keir Starmer to remove the whip. Again, this thing that he said that he wouldn't do, from people who supported removing this thing that was plunging, tens of hundreds of thousands of kids into poverty in this country. And the same is true with the disability welfare. They thought, we'll get away with it. The public have accepted that cuts to welfare are necessary, without realising that actually a huge part of your base are all people who don't elect Labour to remove welfare from the disabled, not from the vulnerable. Just because it polls well doesn't mean people won't react negatively to you focusing on a very vulnerable group to take welfare away from, especially when people in the public have a kind of conflicting view where they believe that you can cut welfare without taking it away from people who deserve it. And the disabled, most people believe that they deserve it. And this was what led to this kind of exodus of voters to the left of the Labour Party. They thought that the people who they'd purged initially were a very small sector of post-militant tendency era Trotskyists, rather than a very large amount of young people, Labour's historic base, at least for the last half a century or so, they would accept these cuts. No, they really would not accept these cuts. It was a broad coalition of anti-austerity voters that supported these huge numbers of people who came to the polls to support Jeremy Corbyn in 2017 and 2019, when Labour got more votes than in 2024, despite getting fewer seats, dramatically fewer seats, right? They thought that they could treat these voters for granted, and then they all left. It must have felt like the best laid plans at the time. Act like the sensible adults in the room, triangulating around these polls that showed the public supported welfare cuts. And this Labour base being outraged meant that there was obviously going to be somebody like Zach Polanski coming in to be able to hoover up those votes that they'd lost. Now, it wasn't only poor policy that hurt them in office. It was their own hubris as well. In December of 2024, McSweeney's close political ally Peter Mandelson was appointed as US ambassador, supposedly for his political experience as a former Blairite minister potentially. It was an appointment that the SW1 cadre revelled in at the time, yet it exploded in scandal 10 months later, when the release of the Epstein files exposed the deep links between Mandelson and Epstein. This plunged the government into crisis. It was then when most people assumed that Starmer's premiership was doomed. Labour was polling lower than ever. His personal approval ratings were worse than any prime minister in history. Yet Starmer refused to go, limping on as leader until the local elections this year, where Labour lost over 1,000 councillors in one of the worst routs in Labour history at a local election. This was the final straw for a once loyal parliamentary Labour Party, staring down the barrel of electoral wipeout in current polling in 2029 and being told stories of abject hatred of the prime minister on the doorsteps of the country. Cabinet ministers told Starmer his time was up, and here we are today, with his time as Prime Minister cut short after just 2 short years. But could this all have been avoided, right? There's a reason I've gone back through all of this history. We've gone through all of Starmer's greatest hits, is to realise that none of this was inevitable. These wounds were self-inflicted. The country isn't ungovernable. They deliberately chose to make the centrepiece of their project of the post-Corbyn era, from Labour Together, from everything that happened when Starmer was in the shadow cabinet, all the way up till today, was one project of essentially trying to remake the Labour Party into this misty-eyed idea of what it was previously, and the socially liberal young people weren't going to be the electoral base forever. Did they win over people? Well, the polls show that they didn't. They'd got fewer votes than in 2019. And you look at what happened in the local elections. Sure, they lost a lot of red wall seats to Reform UK, but they lost loads of seats in the local elections because Green voters had eaten into their vote share and came up through the middle or other parties, or coming up through the middle with other parties. And they lost absolutely droves of seats to the Green Party in London. They lost seats at the general election to independents over the issue of Gaza, which I've not even touched on yet, which I'm sure Dalia will get to in a second. They could have protected their base and created a grand coalition. There was nothing in my mind that would have been such an electoral liability of trying to bring the left in and actually stand on the mandate of party unity that Keir Starmer promised in the leadership election, that would have made sure they didn't win against what happened to the Conservative Party after Liz Truss. None of this was inevitable. They could have built a functioning electoral coalition that brought in the left of the Labour Party and the right of the Labour Party. They chose to make it so that everybody who believed in Labour values deserted them to go elsewhere. And now what are they left with? Like the people crying over Keir Starmer having left, mostly middle-aged, middle-class people. And we're seeing that the Labour Party electorate is the richest electorate in the country. It's what the polling shows. Dalia, do you agree with me? Do you think all of this was inevitable? Or do you think that there could have been a different path that this administration could have taken?
I mean, I think there absolutely could have been a different path. I think it would have had to have been led by a different man, though. I think, as we sort of begin to see the end of this long limp to nothing that was Starmer's premiership, we can sit back now, hopefully for the last time, because I'm really excited to never talk about him again, and think, what was his legacy? What has his legacy been? And I don't think that Starmer was ever necessarily preoccupied with going down in history as a principled man. I think he wanted to go down in history as a kind of respected statesman. He made once he became leader of the Labour Party, he made a big song and dance of, I'm not an ideologue. I'm a pragmatist, and I'm a technocrat, and that was very appealing to a certain strata of, very narrow strata of stratum of British society, very disproportionately concentrated in the media, who felt after the kind of the chaos and the disdain for convention that we had under Truss and Boris Johnson, that this kind of return to technocracy would be really welcome. But to me, none of that actually matters more than the fact that this man was a ruthless and insecure careerist. And that is a really dangerous combination, because when you are both ruthless and insecure, it makes you paranoid, it makes you impulsive, and it makes you incredibly beholden to the loudest and most obnoxious voices in the room. Hence, in this case, it was Morgan McSweeney, and I kind of go, instead of trying to hash out what the unifying ideology around this man was, I think it's really important to see how he sort of spoke about himself. He said early on in his tenure as Labour leader, there is no such thing as Starmerism. He said, there never will be such a thing as Starmerism. I will make a decision, one after the other. And again, he really sold this as an asset. But not only was that really not where the country is, even across the political spectrum, for better or for worse, most people in this country have a very strong appetite for substantive change and understand that we need a substantive intervention to change the direction that the country is going in. But what that whole idea of one decision at a time produces, the consequences of that, there's two of them. First of all, it produces this very, obnoxious short-termism, which basically means that every political decision is made based on this impulsive calculation of what is the most expedient thing in the moment, or what at least is the least risky position to take, with zero regard for like what this is going to mean downstream for the country. And it also breeds capitulation. It breeds, when you don't have a core conviction to anchor you, or a core set of principles to anchor you, you are very easily kind of bent into the direction of power and bent into the direction of the establishment, because that there's nothing else pulling you in the other direction. There's no force pulling you anywhere else. And then that is why we see the kind of record that we see, and the record that I believe he will be remembered for, which is, rolling back human rights protections, punishing disabled people, eroding protections for minorities, expanding the ability of the police to shut down protest, using terror legislation to govern, yes, disruptive, but ultimately peaceful protest, and of course the complete failure to exercise any kind of meaningful sanction against, one of our alleged top allies from committing a genocide. And so that is kind of what comes as a result. And that's what I think that record is an inevitable consequence of a ruthless and insecure man with absolutely no core, who takes pride in having no core. And look, I would say that interpretation is quite a generous one. I could also say, look, this was an intelligent man, a man who had full control of his faculties, who made choice after choice to, in my view, manage a transition towards increased authoritarianism in this country. And he did this, he's a lawyer. He did this with full understanding of what the meaning of legal precedent can do, and what happens when you interfere with the courts, and all of these kind of things that are supposed to be really important to a functioning democracy. He understands all of this, and he made those decisions anyway. So, the generous interpretation is this was a weak man who was able to blow whichever way the wind, the most forceful wind took him. The less generous and probably more honest one is this is a man who made decisions that not only have upheld an economy that is literally killing people, but also oversaw one of the most significant erosions of political and civil liberties in my living memory. And as I've said before, I am so glad to not have to talk about him anymore. Like, please promise me you will never make me look at that fish face, that wet fish of a face ever again. I'm sick of it.
I mean, this is a very long autopsy of his career. Like when you pointed out that there were kind of the SW1 kind of establishment, they all thought this was going to be the safe pair of hands, right? They all kind of fawned over him. There's a really, really, really funny clip. I think it was from 2022, maybe 2023. And it was like the editor of the Financial Times saying, oh, well, the UK's populism moment is over. And I was just like, these people do not know what's coming. And again, there was the level of hubris that these people were engaging in, that thought the, same old, the stability will be the change, would cut it. And here we are, we have Reform ahead in the polls, we have, populists coming in from the other side of the political spectrum as well, and everything has absolutely collapsed.
Yeah, I mean, you have people with full professional careers going to homeless shelters and going to food banks. Like that's a society that is breaking apart. That is a society that's collapsing in on itself. And the idea, and I think this is also, I mean, look, the media is more elite of an institution than the House of Lords. There is a higher proportion of privately educated people in editorial positions in the British media than there are in the House of Lords. And that class position produces a media that is untethered from the material reality of this country. For them, populism, conservatism, labourism, leftism, this is all just fun discourse. These are not products of structural, material contradictions that are going to be resolved. And they're going to be resolved the hard way, or they're going to be resolved the easy way.
Absolutely, 100% agree with that. Now, Andy Burnham is a tricky man to pin down. He didn't take any questions from the mainstream media at his policy press conference last week, and he's had little time for news interviews since. One person, however, that he did make time for, though, is former England footballer and Goal Hanger podcast head honcho Gary Lineker. Now, he's not someone known for asking the tough questions, but he didn't shy away from pinning Burnham down on foreign relations.
Obviously, our relationship with America is hugely important. How are you going to deal with Donald Trump?
Maybe in a similar way to the way I've just described. I'll just meet him where where he's at. And, I like to think I've got some personality myself, and I'll deal with him very upfront in the same way. I think he likes people to deal with him. He described Manchester as some town when he was referring to my position, and I might have to. You know what Manx are like, Gary. That won't have gone down fantastically well in the city I used to represent.
Have you spoken to him yet at all?
No, not yet. So that will come in the next few days. But yeah, it's about being yourself, isn't it? It's about respecting the office, the relationship, the UK-US relationship. But, where you disagree, do it, but do it in a way that is kind of meeting him where he's at.
Now, this is interesting. It's super interesting to understand that, he is going to be a little bit more forthright. One thing we've seen from he who shall not be named is that we have had kind of real bowing down to what Trump wants. We've really kind of taken what he wanted lying down. We've used the bases in like RAF Fairfords to allow Trump to be able to attack Iran at the behest of Benjamin Netanyahu. We've gone into negotiations and we've given him, increased cost of NHS medication in response to hopefully maybe please don't tariff us as much as everybody else. And the potential for someone to change that dynamic by being more forthright in terms of our interests when he's in negotiations could be really interesting to see how that works. Trump is known, when we've seen him in negotiations with other leaders and other people in politics, to not actually respect people who don't respect themselves. People who've stood up to him have managed to actually get better deals than those that have bowed down. You look, for example, at Mamdani's relationship with Donald Trump, openly called him like a fascist in the Oval Office, and still managed to get a sweetheart deal for New York City. And in this country, everybody hates Trump. He's got cataclysmically low approval. Even reform voters don't like Donald Trump. And if Andy Burnham wants to be popular, standing up to Donald Trump and looking like somebody who can really negotiate from a position of strength, I think that'd be a way that he would be able to win over a bunch of people that have been spurned by the previous leadership's more kind of, I guess, supine position they have taken with the Trump administration. Now, did it all come out potentially what he said there? I don't know, but it is certainly interesting to see somebody who's already saying that they're going to negotiate from a potential position of strength. Now, Lineker also probed him on Labour's response to Israel's genocide in Gaza.
Foreign policy is also important to a lot of people, and I've heard you talk about it yourself. And I think one of the reasons that the previous incumbent in Downing Street struggled was the way he dealt with the ongoing genocide, I think, in Gaza and what's happening in Lebanon as well. What's your thoughts on how you're going to cope with that and how you're going to deal with that situation?
Well, I did address Gaza directly last week, and I recognised that Labour got it wrong. I mean, obviously, the attacks of October the 7th were horrendous, but at the same time, I looked then at what happened in the aftermath and has carried on happening. And it's possible to criticise both things rather than just pick a side. So I said, in my view, it was wrong for the suggestion to be made that essential supplies could be closed off. It was an impression given, and but sometimes in politics, when those impressions land with people, they can cause real hurt. And I took the moment to say that was something that I should acknowledge was wrong and apologise for, which I did. And I think, as you said in your question, I have real concerns about, the destruction of Gaza and, the disproportionate nature of that. So, from my point of view, I, will always try and call it as I see it in the fairest way that I possibly can. I won't shy away from saying those things. I did call for a ceasefire very, very early on, and I think, again, Labour was late to do that. It's a fast-moving world now, and what I've kind of found increasingly in my political career is, people have to take clear positions quickly, and that's the way the world is right now, and I will do my best in this job to do that. But I recognise in this particular instance, we do have to reflect on where we didn't get it right in the past.
What's interesting there for me is that, first of all, we didn't respond to Gary Lineker calling it a genocide with what you hear is everybody else go, well, it's not been officially ruled a genocide yet, which again, that could potentially cause some angst from some sectors of society. But, not pushing back is something we've seen from lots of people who have done so. Is an interesting little tidbit there. But what was also interesting, specifically calling out the comments that Keir Starmer made on LBC as well, and also specifically saying, we need to be more forthright and take clear positions early. And if there's one thing that we've not had, especially on something like Israel and Gaza for the last few years, is any sense of moral clarity from many people. So again, we're not getting hard and fast commitments just yet, outside of, apologies for what's previously been said. But if this leads to some kind of foreign policy prospectus, which is a little bit more forthright in its positioning, that could be welcome. We'll have to see further down the line. Now, those comments we did hear, however, have not gone down well with pro-Israel figures. Spectator contributor Jonathan Sacerdoti had this response to Burnham's comments last night on Talk TV.
About some of this actual content of what he said, I don't want people to think this is just a whinge for no reason. It was so misguided what he said about Israel. He said that Netanyahu's government is clearly attempting to make a two-state solution impossible. Did it not occur to him that maybe the Palestinians made a two-state solution impossible when they burst over the border into southern Israel and raped and murdered and kidnapped people, killed children in front of their parents and parents in front of their children, as we've said many times, did all those horrific, barbaric, unthinkable things? Does he not think that maybe a two-state solution was impossible regardless of Bibi Netanyahu? He says that, he apologized for what the Labour Party had done towards the beginning of the war, i.e. the closer you go back towards that horrific act on October the 7th. He said that the initial response didn't get it right, that the response has too often not been good enough. But remember, this is a Labour government, which in the thick of this, when there were still hostages being held in tunnels and tortured and starved and killed in the Gaza Strip by the Palestinians, this government that he is now going to lead are the ones who decided to recognize a Palestinian state as a reward for that. Yep. At a time when it delayed, according to the Americans, delayed the release of hostages because it meant that Hamas actually were incentivized by what Keir Starmer said to hang on and make no concessions, to hang on and toughen their position, because those were the conditions under which Keir Starmer said Britain would recognize a Palestinian state. So that's what he should be apologizing for, that the Labour government did. But instead, he's trying to make it worse, and he's trying to say that all of that wasn't bad enough. So it really is, either he understands nothing about the situation there, or worse, he understands everything about it, and he really doesn't care about any kind of sensible and peaceful resolution for this, nor about the Jewish community in the United Kingdom, who are mostly better informed than him on this and care deeply about it.
Now, the idea that somehow the October 7th attacks were the first thing that made a two-state solution unviable is quite funny to me, given that it was already unviable before October the 7th. And in my mind, October the 7th was part and parcel of the fact that such a negotiation had basically become impossible. Violence was always going to be inevitable, given Israel's continuous incursions into the West Bank, into Gaza, what they did in Al-Aqsa, the fact that up until October the 7th, 2023, it had already been the deadliest year for Palestinians in many, many, many years. The two-state solution had already been made impossible by the policies of Netanyahu that preceded October the 7th. Right? So the idea that somehow that Hamas are the ones who are to blame here for making such a thing impossible, I find difficult to believe, when the settlements were already happening up until then. The continued occupation had been obviously from 1967 until then in terms of Gaza and the West Bank under total Israeli control. The continued use of Palestinian land for Israeli purposes, the governance that Israel continually inflicted upon Palestinians through occupation that made the two-state solution impossible, and the fact that there were basically no negotiations for years and years and years, and in fact, the fact that Hamas had been allowed to have money funneled through to them via Qatar because of Netanyahu. Well, Netanyahu had allowed this to happen because it had deliberately made sure that there was a difference in governance between Fatah in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza to make negotiations impossible as well. Netanyahu is patient zero for a two-state solution being impossible, and October the 7th and the violence that broke out was part and parcel of that impossibility, in my opinion. Now, when it comes to the hostage releases being far less likely because the Palestinian state been recognized, according to the Americans, of course, which of course perfectly believable people, the Trump administration here. Well, The hostages did all get released. That's a thing that happened even after the Palestinian state had been recognized. And on top of this, the West Bank is also the Palestinian state as well that had been recognized. Like, even if you have total misgivings for the way Hamas has run Gaza, and it's not like they've run it particularly well, the people in Palestine are the ones who deserve the state. The ones who have the rights to a state are the people who live in Palestine, in the West Bank, and in Gaza. And the actions of Hamas have nothing to do with this. They deserve their state. They have a right to the state. They have the rights to self-determination. And it should have been recognized years ago, regardless of the status of what's happening in Gaza, regardless of the status of who governs what. It's the Palestinian people's right, and it should have been recognized way before Keir Starmer had done so. And the idea that it was somehow a reward for Hamas, in my mind, is nonsensical. Dalia, what did you make of Burnham's comments there, and then the reaction too?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, just that clip that it ended with, I have to kind of start there. I mean, obviously, as you've mentioned, Helena, the idea that we were somehow on the brink of a two-state solution on the 6th of October is laughable. The idea that a state is a reward for good behavior rather than an inalienable right that all people have, again, obscene. But also that clip just, and we'll get on to this, Andy Burnham didn't say anything. Like, all he said was, we need to recognize the suffering of the Palestinians in Gaza. Like, that's essentially the only thing that he really committed to concretely. And it's just like, nothing is enough. Like, nothing, any recognition of the Palestinians as anything other than a bunch of terrorists who deserve to die is unacceptable to pro-Israeli voices. And it just, there is no amount of anything other than that will be characterized as offensive, as, racist or whatever, and it's just, it's unbelievable just because of how gentle the critique that Andy Burnham had there. And, I mean, look, when it comes to kind of to Andy Burnham in the interview with Gary Lineker, look, this is now when we are going to find out who Andy Burnham really is, and sorry to bring him up again, but one thing we have learned from Starmer is a politician's real character comes into focus when they are close to power. Proximity to power is the test, and that is the test that Burnham is currently sitting. You look into Starmer's history and you'll find all these articles, self-described socialist lawyer, all these really carefully thought out articles, that are critical of the state and critical of the law from this leftist perspective. And then, slowly he disintegrates into someone who presided over some of the most authoritarian expansions of police and state power. So, you can't rest too much on what someone's history says, even though, there are parts of Andy Burnham's history that I'm find to be quite compelling. But really the test comes now when power becomes something that is within reach for him. And I have to say, I'm not happy. I'm not happy, Helena. I think, first of all, the headline comment that he's making is that Starmer got it wrong. And it's like, well, obviously. I mean, it's like the one of the most electorally important threats for Labour right now, more so in the last election than reform, was the loss of seats to the Greens and to the Gaza Independents. And 2/3 of the people who left Labour to vote for the Greens said that they did it because of Gaza. And obviously the people who voted for the Gaza Independents largely voted because of Gaza. So, it would be bizarre for him to do anything other than to try and distance himself from that electorally costly strategy. So in rhetoric, at least. So for me, when he gets into the specifics, that's when, again, I start to see the evasiveness. I start to see red flags. He says, we were too slow to call for a ceasefire. Sure. Okay. I mean, it's easy to say in hindsight. And also a ceasefire is probably one of the least controversial opinions that you can possibly have on this topic. He then says, we need accountability for the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza. Okay. What accountability? What are we actually talking about here? Because accountability can just be compassion. It could just be some nice words. And one thing that we have learned from Gaza is that words are incredibly cheap and they're incredibly easy. It's action. that we have severely lacked. You know, he's talked about kind of expanding some of the bans on arms sales. He's talked about some more sanctions on, you know, what they call extremist officials. Again, you know, none of this is particularly putting your neck out there. This is all stuff that Starmer himself probably could have arrived at some point. And so for me, you know, we're not seeing the kind of commitments to real action. For example, a wholesale ban on arms exports, you know, a wholesale sanctioning of officials of the Israeli government. We're not seeing, and also, of course, stop cracking down on protest groups that are trying to redress the issue in Palestine. We aren't seeing those kinds of concrete commitments, and that combined with, you know, the reports that we're hearing that he's backed off of possibly making Ed Miliband chancellor and gone towards Shabana Mahmoud, that to me signals a lot of more of the same. And if he's being this evasive before he's even actually sitting in office, I have no reason to believe, it doesn't normally happen in British politics, that someone becomes more radical when they, you know, get into power than when they're sort of standing on the sidelines of it.
Yeah, that's the big problem, is that so far in terms of basically all policy, it's all been talked about, or it's all been discussed in terms of what Burnham has said so far in like the most broadest terms possible. Like he says, we need to find like moral clarity. We need to make clear positions. Like, please make a clear position.
Yeah.
State policy, state things that you're going to do. Obviously, Gaza is one big thing, but in terms of international relationships, like with Trump, like saying that you're going to deal with him robustly is one thing. Are you going to try and negotiate for a better deal for the NHS? Are you going to try and relinquish, you know, their use of our bases to be able to bomb Iran? Are you going to do actual material things? Or it's going to sound like you're going to be slightly different and try and appease people without the material policy there. Because again, he's left himself open to do good things. He's left himself the room in terms of his rhetoric to be significantly better. The question, of course, is the mood music looking like those things are going to happen? As you've basically said already from the current like cabinet appointments we think are going to happen, doesn't look like it, does it?
Yeah, I mean, say something that Starmer wouldn't have. Then maybe I'll believe that you might do something that Starmer wouldn't have. You know, and that for me is kind of the red flag and the signal that we need to still keep up pressure, because when you boil it down, that interview was basically like, it's a little bit awful, isn't it, what those Palestinians have gone through? You know, I feel kind of bad for them. And I mean, like, what good is that? You know, that doesn't stop F-35 components being shipped over to Israel and being used on Palestinian children, does it?
Yeah, I saw a tweet today, which was well, if Labour have got it wrong on the genocide, then shouldn't the people who got it right on the genocide not be sent to prison? And I was like, okay, that seems like a fair point. People are absolutely losing their minds over the England versus Argentina World Cup match last night. But the fury isn't over the Thomas Tuchel's tactical errors that many are blaming for England's bitter defeat. Instead, it's been provoked by the Argentinian players holding up a banner after the match that said Las Malvinas son Argentinas, which can probably tell translates to the Falklands are Argentinian. The players had taken the banner from some fans in the crowd. A few hours after the match, in what could best be described as an odd timing, Argentina's foreign minister accused a Royal Navy warship of making a, quote, illegal journey into its waters earlier this month. Number 10 countered that it had notified Argentina of the trip, which it said was to Chile to support British Antarctic survey operations. Now, just in case there's the smallest of chances that you don't know, the Falkland Islands are a British overseas territory, and the background to this row is, of course, the 1982 war fought between Britain and Argentina over the Falklands after Argentina invaded. The 74-day conflict killed 649 Argentinian soldiers, 255 British military personnel, and 3 islanders, and the dispute over sovereignty is ongoing. The reaction here has ranged from calls for increased funding for the Royal Navy, yes, that was Nigel Farage, to demands that Argentina get kicked out of the tournament altogether. Every Argentine player in the English Premier League who took part in this ugly anti-British display should be stripped of their UK work visa. There should be zero tolerance for this. I think they might be going a bit far, Niall. Like, maybe FIFA would have to look into their rules in terms of no political symbols at the World Cup, but wholesale bans and stripping people of access to tournaments, maybe a bit far. Liberal Democrat leader Ed Davey had this to say on Sky News.
I've written to the president of FIFA because these are the rules that he is supposed to implement and make sure are adhered to. It's a clear breach of FIFA's rules, what happened with those Argentine players making a political statement with that banner, which is deeply insulting to the people of Falkland Islands and to the families of the veterans who gave their lives against that illegal invasion. For that to happen, that's why FIFA has those rules. And FIFA should therefore implement those rules. And that would mean a ban for the 6 Argentine players who were holding that banner and celebrating around it.
Ooh, Ed Davey has written a strongly worded letter to Gianni Infantino. That'll do it. It's got the hand of Trump. The government has also weighed in. Here's Business Secretary Peter Kyle speaking to journalists this morning.
My reaction is that it was entirely inappropriate. Politics needs to be separate from football. In fact, the World Cup has one of its central tenets, that politics is separate from football. Now, that is now a matter for FIFA. I expect FIFA to do its investigation thoroughly.
Or is anyone who looks less convincing in a hard hat and high vis than Peter Kyle? Answered on a postcard. Keir Starmer later backed Kyle's statement, and Downing Street said that, quote, "The World Cup might not be ours, but the Falkland Islands definitely are." Now look, to be clear, there is zero chance of Argentina getting kicked out of the World Cup or any players getting suspended for the final. They've obviously broken FIFA rules on political action and team misconduct, but FIFA usually takes action on things like that after a tournament is finished. And Argentina has been in trouble over this before. In 2014, players held up a banner with the same message before a friendly against Slovenia. FIFA's reaction then was a measly £20,000 fine. But even if there are no immediate consequences for the Argentinian football team, we do seem to be heading for a diplomatic incident. Obviously, the Argentina players did something stupid and crass that they knew was breaking the rules. But did it all need to escalate to this level? Dalia, what do you think? Big fuss over nothing or a serious diplomatic incident?
I mean, I think this is a real case of like everyone just needs to seriously get a grip. I mean, it's a banner. It's not a battleship. And by the way, there is a difference between the two. And I find the fact that the same people who are saying, you know, keep politics out of football. How could you put this banner at the World Cup? You know, how can you use football as a stage for this, you know, highly offensive banner? Are in the same breath being like, well, because of what happened in this football match, we need to fund the Navy. And we need to, you know, do some military posturing. You know, I mean, it's ridiculous. And the whole idea of keeping politics out of football, I mean, look, it's never a neutral rule. It's only ever invoked when the politics on display are politics that we don't like or that someone doesn't, you know, when you see politics that you don't like in somewhere like the World Cup, that's when you say, oh, we should keep politics out of football. Because of course, there's always politics in football, especially in the World Cup. I mean, the World Cup is a global stage that has like millions of eyes on it. It's one of the most important, you know, global stages and most kind of watched global stages that there is. And these kinds of massive global tournaments, you know, whether it's the World Cup or the Olympics, there's always a process of things being hashed out, you know, whether it's like national identity or geopolitics or state building. You know, when you know, Nazi Germany hosted the Berlin Olympics, it was political. When South Africa was the first African country to host the World Cup, that was political. When the coach of the Egyptian football team used Egypt getting to, you know, the furthest they've ever gotten in the World Cup to hang the Palestinian flag, that was political. Like, people are always going to use a stage like the World Cup to make statements. And I think there's a really big difference between, you know, fans or footballers using the pitch to make these statements, which we can then, you know, talk about and discuss and disagree with, versus like actual MPs using it to like to posture militaristically or to kind of call for people to be banned. You know, that I think is crossing a line. But people using what is a global stage in this way, I think, you know, you can argue about whether it's appropriate or not, but I don't think you can argue that it's going to stop. But also I have to say that with the whole Falklands thing, I do find the whole way in which, you know, Britain is like, well, you know, the most important thing here is self-determination, you know, and I'm just like, be real. Like, that's not why the British state is really preoccupied with the Falkland Islands. You know, the reason that the British state is preoccupied with the Falkland Islands is because there's a ton of gas there, there's a ton of fishing there, and it's a really important, it's like geographically situated in a really important place, and it's really important for like scientific and as a scientific and military base. So let's just be like really real here about why this is a flagship issue. But yeah, I think it just looks incredibly petty. It looks incredibly childish for politicians to be throwing their weight into what is essentially just a banner on a pitch, especially when the British state is currently in power. Like, the Falklands is under British jurisdiction. And if that ever changes, it's not going to be because of a banner on a pitch. It's going to be because of a million other, far more important reasons. So I think, the posturing around, the shock of politics in football, especially when, in this particular World Cup tournament, you have people, members of football team, sorry, I'm not a football person. People from football teams and football staff and fans literally being denied entry to the US because of, Trumpism. And you're trying to tell me that this isn't political? I mean, come on.
Literally, imagine Gianni Infantino being accused of getting political. Heaven forfend that he might get political. It's like people say, oh, Eurovision's become political. Oh, no, has it? Oh, God, I couldn't believe my ears when someone told me Eurovision had become political, especially given, the way people use FIFA is geopolitical, right? The interest that Saudi Arabia had in being the people who are going to host it in 2034 was done via being able to lobby with all FIFA member states to be able to vote on kind of the future people who are going to host the World Cup, right? It's used geopolitically. It's always going to be political, and people are never going to be able to get away from that.
Yeah, and I mean, with Qatar, for example, why would Qatar, a country that is not a footballing country, and, doesn't actually have an appropriate environment or climate to host a football tournament, spend all that money to host the World Cup? Because it is a huge act of state building, and it opens doors for you in all kinds of other ways. And so, it's in the DNA of it. And I think trying to hide behind this technicality that this is when football becomes political and this is when it doesn't. Let's just have a conversation about the politics that's on display, because that's actually the conversation that we're having, not this kind of abstract attachment to the idea that you can take politics out of anything, really, let alone, all of the nations of the world getting together to fight a competitive tournament, as if that's not going to cause issues, or as if broader tensions aren't going to be hashed out in that context.
Yeah, 100%. Well, thank you very much, Dalia, for joining me tonight.
Thanks for having me, Helena.
It's an absolute pleasure as always. And thank you everyone else for joining at home and tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.